Okay, good morning everybody. My name is Vladimír Zeman and I'm the president of the European Gymnastics Trampoline Technical Committee. First of all, I would like to wish you all a very healthy and successful year. I know this seems to be very unrealistic now, but I think that we all will return step by step to normal. It is also challenging, but we need to continue our activities as much as possible and stay optimistic. And I'm so happy to have you here because you show you are still working and you are still interested in the trampoline gymnastics, even the situation is not very good. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you all for the start of the second package of European Gymnastics, webinars organized by the Trampoline TC. The topic of the webinar today is reducing injury risk for all our disciplines. I'm convinced that the knowledge and experience presented to you by the expert will be interesting for you. I would be also happy if today's webinar will help you to reduce the injury risk of your gymnasts. I'm very pleased to introduce you today the expert who is the lead physio for the British Trampoline and British Gymnastics Intensive Rehabilitation Program. You may know her from multiple European and World Championships and European Commonwealth and Olympic Games. She has worked as a physiotherapist for British Gymnastics for 13 years. She is also sharing her knowledge with the coaches and medical colleagues to help optimize gymnast health and performance and teaches on British Gymnastics high performance coaching courses. She is also a guest lecturer on the Master of Science Sport Medicine program at the University College London. Welcome, Lindy, Laszig. Hello.
Hi, thank you, Vladimir. Just wanted to say thank you to you and to the technical committee for inviting me to present this morning, and also thank you to the participants for joining us. I hope that you find something that's useful. If you have any questions, please just put them on the chat and then we'll try and answer them at the end. If I share my screen with you then. Start. Now, a lot of coaches and other medical staff ask me about injury prevention. And I think we need to be realistic that in the sport that we're in, the gymnasts are doing incredibly complex skills and reaching incredible heights. So the chance of injury is always going to be there. So it would be unrealistic to suggest that we could prevent every injury. So I think we really need to talk about reducing the risk of injury rather than trying to prevent injury. We also know that it's not easy, because if it was easy, none of us would be here this morning, because we would have cracked it. And we wouldn't have any issues with our athletes becoming injured. Just some definitions of injury then. And we probably need to break it up into acute injuries and overuse injuries. Now, it kind of varies from year to year, but probably on average we see about 50% of our injuries are acute. So those are the single event, the accident. They have a bad landing on DMT or tumbling. They land on the side frame of trampoline. They hyperextend their knee. So they were fine a minute ago, and then something happens and they have an injury. About 50% of what we see are overuse injuries, though. So that's linked to an accumulation of damage to the body from repeated small loads rather than from one single big load. So when we talk about an accumulation of tissue damage, then what do we mean? If we look at the normal training cycle then and what that does to the body, before the gymnast walks into a training session, they'll be at their base level. They'll then train and that will do some damage to the tissues of the body. That's a perfectly normal process. The gymnast then has time to recover. The tissues of the body not only recover to where they were, but they actually start to get stronger and more resistant to being injured. So if you train again at the correct time, you again do a little bit of damage, but as you recover from that session, the tissues will again get stronger. And that's the process of training, and that's perfectly normal if we get it right. The problem comes in, though, when we don't get it right. So if you train, you do some damage, but you don't fully recover before the next training session, you then do some more damage to the tissues. Oh, sorry. Again, they don't fully recover. You train again, you do some more damage, and eventually all that microscopic damage will build up and you can end up with an injury. So that's what we're wanting to avoid. But that's how overuse injuries come about. Now, the gymnast isn't going to get pain immediately. There often has to be a reasonable amount of damage to the tissues before they'll start to notice any pain and say anything to you as a coach. So where do we see the most injuries then in trampoline gymnastics, trampoline, tumbling, and double mini trampoline? Ankle and foot injuries, and they might be acute from a bad landing or an overuse type injury. Lower back is generally an overuse injury, but can be acute as well. Lower leg is more commonly an overuse problem, and knees could be acute or overuse. So typically double mini trampoline landing, we do unfortunately see a lot of quite nasty knee injuries. If we talk about trying to prevent injury or reduce the risk of injury, we need to think about what the causes are. And various researchers in sports science and sports medicine have tried to come up with some models of why a gymnast or an athlete in any sport might get injured. Going back as far as 2005, there were a couple of people who tried to come up with a model that works well for acute injuries, but not so well for overuse. But they talked about internal risk factors, so that's specific to the athlete, so that could be age, gender, body composition, general health, physical fitness, etc. And there are certain things there that might predispose the athlete to becoming injured. If you then add in the sport, what they call external risk factors, it can then take an athlete who has their own individual risk factors, add in the external ones, and you've got an athlete who is then more vulnerable to being injured. This section is where the model gets messy because they're really talking about an inciting event for an acute injury, but it doesn't cover why an athlete might get an overuse injury. So moving forward then, in 2018, a group of researchers tried to come up with a different model. It's using some of the factors that have been talked about before, but what it does do is show that injury is complex because a lot of these factors interact with one another to lead to an athlete becoming injured. So they might be going through a growth spurt, for example, but if they're not doing their sport, they're not going to have a sore knee. If they're sitting at home in their bedroom playing on their phone, it doesn't matter if they're going through a growth spurt because they're not going to injure their knee. But these things do all interact with each other, and that's why injury prevention is so difficult, because there's so many factors that we have to consider. If we go into a little bit more detail though, just to think about what we can and what we can't influence. So we can think about the intrinsic, so the specific to an individual athlete factors, and then the extrinsic factors. But we can also consider whether they're modifiable or non-modifiable. So can we do anything to change them or not? Because there's no point worrying about things that we can't change, but we might need to be aware of them so you can change what you can. So what do I mean by that? So if we talk about the things that as a coach you cannot change, first of all, previous injury. Now, in all sports, if having had a previous injury is the single biggest risk factor for having another injury. So what we really want to avoid is having that first injury to begin with. And then age. At different stages, athletes will be more vulnerable to particular injuries. Certainly in Great Britain with our trampoline gymnasts, we have our senior women who are all over the age of 30. Well, not all of them, but some of them. So that presents a challenge because they've got a lot of years of high load in their bodies already. And just with age and loading over the years, they are quite vulnerable to getting injured and tissues breaking down. Another thing to consider, and this is probably a challenge for all of you, is the growing athlete. So when they go through their growth spurt as teenagers, they are definitely more susceptible to injury, and I'll go into a little bit more detail later as to why that might be. Gender, for example, females are more likely to tear the cruciate ligament in their knee on landing. Males, certainly in gymnastics, are probably less likely to tear the same ligament. And anatomy, genetics, what they've inherited from their parents that you cannot change. So they might have flat feet, they might have quite vulnerable bones in their back because of something that they've inherited. And again, you can't change that, and you often don't even know about it, but it is something that could lead to injury. Also need to think about the rules of the sport and the equipment that they're working on. A trampoline is a trampoline. A landing surface in competition is a landing surface in competition. The rules, whether that's you have to try and stick your landing, or whether that's you're only allowed one out bounce on a trampoline routine, those are things that do put a gymnast more at risk of injury. So for those of you on the technical committee or with any influence in the FIG, it would be lovely if you could bring those things up for discussion. But as it is, we've got to deal with what the rules are. In the training environment, you can look at your safety measures, you can do things into a pit, you can tumble on the fast track instead of the tumble track, but obviously that doesn't help you a huge amount when it comes to competition. In all the trampoline and tumbling disciplines, there is very high mechanical force on the body, and I'll go into a little bit of detail around that in a moment. But again, we can't really influence if they're going to jump that high or be tumbling with that power and speed. The forces are going to be high. We cannot influence that. Then moving on to things that are individual to a particular athlete that you may or may not be able to influence. So there can be psychological factors, so how well they're focused and concentrating in a session. But also things like the attitude towards risk. Do they like to take risks, or are they quite scared to take risks? Are they tolerant to pain? Because if they are tolerant to pain and motivated to do a particular competition, they won't tell you that something's wrong. They will keep training through quite a bit of pain before they even tell you that there's an issue. And often they can have quite a bad injury before you know anything about it. And then thinking about body composition and nutritional factors. We obviously, unless we're qualified nutritionists, need to be quite careful in any communication we have with athletes around their body composition. But nutrition can also include, are they eating the right food to fuel their training? And are they eating the right food at the right time to recover from training? And it's not just about muscles, it's about, are they eating enough protein to support their tendons and their ligaments? And are they eating the right foods to support their bone health? Think about your female gymnasts, if they should be having a menstrual cycle, are they having regular periods? Because if they're not, their bone health is very likely to be at risk, and they're more likely to get stress fractures or an actual fracture from an acute injury if they land badly. What's their technique like? Are they doing their skills technically correctly, or are there problems with the way they do the skill that puts excessive load on their body and makes them more likely to get injured? What about their physical qualities, their physical preparation and conditioning? And I'll go into more detail in a moment. And then finally, let's think about training load. How much are they doing in a week, in a month, in a year? How quickly do they progress their training load? And then if we think about the things that as a coach you have the most influence over, well, it's clearly the technical competence, clearly the physical qualities, and clearly the training load. So those are the things that we're going to focus on in this webinar. So when we talk about physical qualities, then what do I mean? Muscle strength, but then we can break that down into, is that maximal strength, the rate of force development, strength endurance, and agonist to antagonist ratios. So thinking about quads to hamstrings or abdominal muscles to back muscles, for example. Movement patterns or their dynamic alignments, which I've got a nice video to show you. Do they have enough mobility or flexibility in their shoulders, in their hips, and in their ankles are probably the main area for injury prevention. Their kinesthetic awareness, understanding of where their body is in space, where different parts of their body are in relation to each other. Again, if that's not as good as it might be, they're more likely to get injured. And then are they fit enough? Do they have the anaerobic capacity to get through a trampoline routine of 10 skills? And do they have the aerobic capacity to get through a 2 or 3 hour training session? If we talk about high mechanical loads and the forces that gymnasts are exposed to, measured from the HD device, somewhere between 12, maybe up to even 15 or 16 times body weight, depending on how high the gymnast is actually jumping. So if we look at what that means for a 60 kilogram gymnast, every time they hit the trampoline in a routine, their body's exposed to 720 kilograms. So for one routine, that's 7,000 kilograms. Now what that equates to is an elephant trampling all over them. That is a lot of force on that gymnast's body, and that's just one routine, and that's not the in jumps or the outbounds. It's a similar picture for tumbling. Most of the measurements that have been done with force plates in an artistic floor, but we can assume that tumbling is probably similar but potentially higher, because obviously their specific tumbling gymnasts are much more skilled at it. Again, you're looking at nearly 7,000 kilograms for that athlete for one tumbling pass, which again would be the equivalent of 6 cars. And that's a lot for the human body to be exposed to. Double mini trampoline, again, we're looking at something around there. Remember, they are running on a relatively hard surface in bare feet as they approach the mini trampoline. So consider the running load as well, which isn't so relevant for the tumblers. So if we want to try and protect gymnasts from injury, we need to think about a few main points. We know they're being exposed to enormous loads, so make sure their body is in the best possible position when those loads are applied. So in the bottom of the trampoline, when they're hitting the tumble track, and when they're taking a landing. We know which parts of the body are most at risk of injury, so we can do some physical preparation specifically around those areas to try and reduce the risk. And then also look at planning their training program and make sure that they're getting good recovery as well. So if we move on then to looking at alignment, and I'll just show you a video here. So these are actually some of our artistic gymnasts, but it would apply to all the disciplines that we work with. So this is what you want to see when they're doing what is a very simple jump and land. So feet hip width apart, knees facing forward over their toes, landing nicely, knees over toes, single leg, lose their balance on landing, but actually their initial jump is pretty decent. You can also look at repeated jumping. Again, feet are hip width apart, feet are facing forward, knees are facing forward. That is pretty good. Then we want to move on to the not so good. Just look at what that right foot is doing. Look at how the knee's going inwards. And I would just pause. Sorry, I'll just backtrack a moment actually. Pause there. So this particular gymnast had had a previous ankle injury on his right, and he didn't get his mobility back in his ankle after that injury. So he ended up compensating for it for the rest of his career. And what you can see here is, perhaps not in this frame, but he tends to roll inwards through this part of his foot, and he ended up with a stress fracture in this part of his foot. He also ended up with bone stress in that part of his shin, and he ended up with knee pain. And all of that was linked to the alignment. Whenever he hit the floor, he hit in a really bad position. And when you start adding that up over weeks and months and years, it caused him quite a lot of problems. If I just replay again from there, this is clearly not a gymnast. Although some of our junior gymnasts do look a little bit like this when we ask them to jump. It's worthwhile looking at some single leg stuff as well. Again, this is that gymnast who with the previous injuries, look where the knee's going, the wobble, the alignment. And this is repeated jumps, again, a very poor example. It starts off not too bad, but the more he does, the worse he gets. But straight away, one foot's turned out, knees are drifting inwards. And just the more he does, the worse he gets. And just one more, just looking at a side view. Take off all right. Oh, sorry. Sorry, let me try and find that for you again. There we go. So that was their landing position. Now just have a look. They don't get the heels down. So if they're wobbling around on the toes, they're more likely to injure an ankle, and they're also more likely to injure a knee. It's really important that they get the heels down quickly when they land. Obviously, it's different on a hard surface to a landing mat, but we do still see this on a DMT or tumbling landing surface. So we've looked mainly at front-on views, but let's think about side-on views and what's going on in the lower back, because we get a lot of low back injuries as well. So first thing to note is that normal alignment of the back, it's not completely flat. It is normal that you have some little curves there, and that's absolutely fine. If we look a little bit closer at the anatomy and where injuries tend to come in, two main areas, which is stress fractures, which tend to come in around this section here, and disc injuries, which happen more in the front and in that area. And if I can show you another image just to try and explain how these come about. When somebody is upright or in a neutral position, so neutral standing position there, if they were then to take an impact, so a hard landing, 12 times body weight, what we see is actually the force is fairly well distributed between the front part of the spine and the back part of the spine, so it's spread over as many tissues as possible. That's what we want, ideally. However, if they either contact the tumble track or the trampoline and they're already in extension, what we tend to see is that the load gets focused over these back parts, and that can lead to stress fractures in the back, which I'll show you in the next slide. Equally, if they're landing in a forward bent position, and I don't mean bent at the hips, I mean bent in the back, and again, I've got some pictures for you, what we would tend to see is that the load is mainly going through the front part of the spine and through the discs, and that can cause damage to the discs if it's done repeatedly. So for those of you who are interested, that's what a stress fracture would look like, a break through that section of bone. And if you look at the discs, the healthy part of the disc is in the front, and the damaged part of the disc is just that little bit further back and can press on nerves and cause all kinds of problems. So what do I mean by landing position then? Well, there is the best in the world, really. That is Salomon, and if you look at his landing position, apart from a judging point of view, that is pretty much perfect. But from a biomechanical point of view, you really couldn't get any better than that. So he's got his feet hip width apart. Yes, one is slightly further back, but not enough to worry about. Feet hip width apart. It appears that his knees are hip width apart. He's got a good angle at his ankles. He's got a good angle at his knees. He's got a good angle at his hips. And if you look at his low back, it's pretty much straight. There's even the natural, very slight arch there. That is perfect. I wouldn't be critical at all of his upper body because he's going to move out of that position really quick. That is honestly the optimal, best ever landing position you could hope to see. The next image, however, which is an artistic image, and I apologize for the quality because it came off video. But if you look at the position of this gymnast's lower back, and she's actually really bent forward in the low back, you'll do one landing like that and you'll be fine. You'll probably do 50 landings like that and you'll be fine. But if you're doing that 300 times, 500 times, thousands of times over the course of your career, you will eventually start to cause some damage to the discs in your back. We definitely see that in TUMBs and in DMT, so just watch that, and you really want to be avoiding those where possible. So thinking of why an alignment might be poor, well, we need to think about both physical and technical factors, but if we break that down, to think about movement patterns and just the gymnast's awareness of what they're doing. Sometimes they just don't even know they're doing it wrong, so you do need to go back and coach them and teach them the correct patterns. Other times they know what they want to do, but they just don't have the strength to do it, and that's particularly the younger gymnasts. So they can do a double leg squat, but if you put them onto one leg, or you add a bit of load, and they're just not strong enough to be able to keep the good alignment. It can also be mobility, and again, it's typically around the ankles, around the hips and the shoulders. But there can also be technical faults that you need to address. So for example, throwing the head back on a backwards takeoff, not getting their arms into the correct overhead position on takeoff, their back excessively flexed or extended. On a backwards takeoff, they might slip the hips forward, which again takes their low back into too much extension. Or screwing a twist off the floor or off the trampoline bed. And again, particularly it's the backward twist. So they're a bit of extension and a bit of rotation. And if that's happening through their whole body, that's fine. But if that screwing is focused in their low back, they do tend to get injured. So what can we do in terms of physical preparation then? Again, just talking about our commonly injured areas, which is those 4 that are highlighted. So we can talk about specific physical prep. So some work around the foot and ankle, including the calf. Some work generally around their legs. Some work around their trunk and lower back and abdominals. And then don't forget the linking areas. So the hips are really important, not just for performance and force transfer, but also strength around the hips will help to protect both the legs and low back. Also their shoulders, we don't see many shoulder injuries, but if they don't have the mobility and the strength in their shoulders, that can lead to injuries, particularly low back. And finally, do some work on landings. Now I'm going to go through some specific examples of these, but before I do, we need to think separately but also linked when it comes to protecting their bodies compared to what they need for performance. And you might need to do some separate work to meet both of those needs. Now, an example of that would be, for performance, you need them to be powerful in their legs. So they need to be very good at jumping and being powerful in jumps. But if you want to protect them from injury, you also need to teach them how to land well. But actually, probably, ability to jump sits there in performance requirement, but ability to land sits there because it'll protect them from injury. But obviously, if they can land well, they're not going to get deductions on landing either to the same extent. If we talk about the trunk and core, they need to be able to do V-sits to get into their pike shapes. They need to be able to do dorsal raises, for example, to get quickly into extension and get out of their shapes. But that doesn't give them any protection from injury. So they need to be doing a different type of work for their core and their trunk to protect their low backs from injury. And I'll look at some examples of what that might look like. Now, this is really quite basic, and we could probably spend a full day going through specific physical preparation of every single body area. So there are millions of possible examples, and I've only selected really some basics. But when we're looking at foot, ankle, and calf, certainly want to be doing some work around calf raises, straight leg and bent leg. Be doing some specific ankle work, possibly with a band or with a cable machine. Look at doing some balance work on an unstable surface, so a wobble board or something similar. And then think about their mobility and their actual range in their ankle to take landings. There's plenty of research in gymnastics and other sports which would suggest that if you don't have the mobility in your ankles, you're more likely to injure an ankle, but also more likely to injure a knee. And when we look at this, we would want to get about a 42 to 45 degree angle on this test to protect them from injury. Anything under about 40 degrees, we would definitely want to be working on to improve. Moving on to the legs then, well, first of all, you just need to teach them how to do a good squat, double leg and single leg. And all disciplines should be able to do a squat to at least horizontal with good alignment. I know some trampoline coaches feel it's not relevant because you don't bend your legs that far when you're on trampoline, but our experience would suggest that it doesn't do any harm, and it certainly does a lot of good to get them able to do a good squat and think about the front and side view. Once they can do a good squat body weight, think about adding in endurance and strength components so you can add resistance. Obviously, if you can coach them properly and supervise them, do high load barbell squats. If you're not going to be able to supervise them, often something like a leg press is a better option because you can't go too far wrong and you can't hurt yourself actually doing the strength training. If we move on to the trunk then, We want to do as much work as we can around the neutral position of the trunk to protect them from injury. That doesn't mean that you don't do your V-sits and your dorsal raises, but to protect from injury, examples are some work for the back muscles, so some face down holds, working side muscles, so side plank type work, and then working the abdominal muscles with the Lechner type work. You can obviously add load to this, and there are so many different options aside from the ones that I've shown. What we found in Great Britain with our back injuries, though, is we definitely need to be working all 4 directions. And when we test our gymnasts, if you just test the back or just test the front, it doesn't tell us who is more likely to develop a back injury. But if we test front, back, and both sides, we start to get some scores that can help us predict who is more at risk of getting a problem with their low back. And that allows us to address it, hopefully, before the injury comes on. There's also a lot of benefit, though, in not just working on high load strength and endurance, but also working on the real fine control, so Pilates type stuff. And you really need all 3 components. You need Pilates equivalent work, endurance work, and high load strength work. If we move on to the hip as an important linking area, again, there are a number of things that we can do endurance or strength-wise. So we can look at external rotation and abduction, and band work can be useful for that. And we can also look at higher load hip extension work. So things like hip thrusts, you can add a barbell with your older gymnasts once they are competent and strong enough. Also look at mobility of the front of the hip. What we tend to see is a lot of the gymnasts can be quite tight. They spend 7 hours a day sitting at school, so they get quite short in the front of their hips. And then they come to training, and if they don't have the mobility there, they are more at risk of particularly lower back injuries would be the main concern. Then moving on to shoulders and upper back is a crucial area. Mobility of the upper back, and you want to be thinking about extensions, so you can do some stretches over a foam roller, and also think about rotation. Rotation is the main movement that happens in the upper back, and we found that if gymnasts don't have good mobility there, they are more likely to get an injury in their low back. Also need to look at the shoulders. Now this particular gymnast has pretty decent mobility, so when he's lying on his back, we've got him to bend his knees up so he doesn't cheat and compensate in his low back. But he can easily get his arms up well beyond 180 degrees when gravity's helping him. But when you put him lying face down and get him to try and lift his arms up against gravity, you can see that he's actually not quite getting to 180 degrees. We'd like to see that his hands were sort of up there-ish at least. We have some trampoline athletes who can get their hands up to about there, which is fantastic, but we would certainly want to see at least horizontal. So this gymnast doesn't need to work on his mobility, but he probably needs a little bit more strength work overhead to get his shoulders strong enough, shoulders and upper back, to be able to get his arms into a good position. Then train landings, and there's lots of variation around this, but you would want to teach them to begin with just do basic double leg landings off a low box. And then what you would want to do is start doing that off progressively higher boxes as they get better. You can then take that to a single leg landing, so bring the height back down, make sure they can land with good alignment, then take the height up. And you can also think about adding complexities, so don't just jump off forwards, but jump off backwards, jump off sideways, add a quarter turn, add a half turn, add a full turn, and make sure you're getting them to twist in their non-dominant direction as well as their preferred direction. But don't compromise, make sure that their technique on every single landing is absolutely perfect. And if they can't do that, take a step back, make it a little bit easier for them, make sure that they're feeling an absolutely perfect landing every time they do it. And again, think front and side view. We spend a lot of time looking from the front, but make sure you're looking from the side and they're getting the heel down and bending properly through the ankle, the knee and the hip, and that their back is in a good position. So think of Zalman, not the artistic gymnast that I showed you. A few things to think about around the growth spurt. I think we all know as coaches and medics that it is a high risk time in a gymnast's development. That's the same in other sports. So we need to think about managing each individual gymnast through their growth spurt. Remember that growth spurts will happen at different times for different athletes. Some of them, they might be 12, others might be 14. So when it comes to age group, it is a bit of a challenge really that you can't manage all your gymnasts in the same way. So when they grow, what tends to happen is that their bones will grow quicker than their muscles. But as the bones grow, they also become weaker. So the growth plates, where at the ends of the bones where the actual growth happens, are particularly vulnerable and weak while they're growing. And also the bones of the spine don't reach full strength until in your 20s, but particularly vulnerable during that big teenage growth spurt. Muscle strength will be relatively reduced owing to quick growth. Flexibility will also be relatively reduced. You've all seen that with your gymnast who used to have a brilliant pike shape and suddenly can't even touch their toes because they've grown a lot in the last 3, 4, 6 months. There's also a lot of research telling us that their awareness of where their body is will change. So they might be able to land brilliantly, brilliant alignment, and then 6 months later, they look like some of the gymnasts that you saw in that video where the knees are drifting inwards and they can't do a single leg landing at all. Also, their center of mass changes very quickly, and you'll know that as coaches, that skills that they used to find easy, they suddenly can't do because their center of rotation is different. So all of those things will affect their technique and affect their timing. Add on to that some structural weakness, and that makes them very much at high risk of injury. So often what you'll need to do is go back and work particularly hard on muscle strength, work particularly hard on flexibility, and work particularly hard on basic things like, can they still do a squat? Can they still do a single leg squat? Can they still land well? And you're going to have to keep working on that really hard for that year or 18 months that they're in the growth spurt. Finally, then, if we move on to training load and program planning. So across sports, there's been a lot of work on how much is too much. And I think there's a consensus across every single sport that what they said here, poor load management is a major risk factor for injury. And while every sport is different, that does seem to apply across the board. So what do we mean by load? So we can talk about load in terms of physical effort, ranging from no effort at all to extremely hard. But also in our sport, we need to think about mental effort as well, because they're doing such difficult, complex, and dangerous skills that if they're not able to concentrate, or if mentally it's taking a lot out of them, they're more likely to have a physical injury. So how can we measure load? And again, this comes from work that's been done across a lot of different sports. Well, we can talk about external load. So you could look at that quite simplistically and just go, how many hours are they training? But obviously that also depends on how many gymnasts are training together, whether they're 2 gymnasts training for 1 hour or 6 gymnasts training for 3 hours. That's going to make a difference to how much they've actually done in that time. In running-based sports, they use GPS a lot in football and rugby. And you can also look at repetition count and then what that might mean for us. But it's also worth considering what we call internal load. So that's the gymnast's perception of how hard the session was, because two gymnasts could do exactly the same session. They could do the same number of routines, the same drill work, and one gymnast will go, oh yeah, that was pretty easy, about a 5 out of 10. And another gymnast would go, I found that so hard, that was a 9 out of 10 for me. And that's important to consider as well as the individual response. Also, maybe less relevant to our sports, but we can look at things like heart rate and blood lactate levels, which is obviously much more complex to monitor. A lot of research, certainly in other sports, just takes a simple multiply the amount of time that the session took and then the athlete's perception of how hard that was, and use that as a measure. It's relatively easy, but it's also relatively inaccurate. So thinking more specific to our sport then, this is measuring external load, so whether you call it repetition count. So we can think about the number of skills on trampoline. We could look at height, time of flight, because we know that the higher you jump, the greater the mechanical load on the body. What DD are they doing? Are they doing single somersaults? Are they doing voluntary routines? That's going to make a difference. And are they doing full routines, part routines, individual skills? Similar thought process for tumbling double mini trampoline. The number of skills, the difficulty, are they doing full or partial passes, and what surface are they doing it on, fast track, and what surface are they landing on? Other things to consider is their overall training load, just randomly split between low, moderate, or high. How consistent are they? Does one week look very much like the next week? Or are we finding that they train really well for 2 weeks? And I think we all have this challenge at the moment. They do a few weeks really good training, and then they come into contact with somebody who's had COVID, and they have to stay at home for 10 days and isolate. And then what happens when they come back into training after isolation? We're having huge challenges around that, and I'm sure all of you are in the same situation pretty much. And how quickly can we progress their load? Because we do know that if they try and increase their load too quickly, it does put them at risk of injury. Again, a lot of work has been done, mainly in field sports, football, Australian rules football, and it may or may not be relevant to us. I think the principles are relevant, but the actual numbers are debatable. A lot of you might have seen this graph about 5-6 years ago. This was used a lot, and we all thought we found the answer to training load and injury. And then when we tried to apply it, we realized that it wasn't quite so simple. Essentially what this looks at when we're talking about the acute to chronic workload ratio is you look at what the athlete's done over the previous 4 weeks, however you choose to measure that, and you take an average of those 4 weeks, and then you plan this week based on what they've done over the last 4. And there is a suggestion when you look at that and you look at the ratios that, that if your training load is somewhere between 80% of your average and 130% of your average, the risk of injury is quite low. That can be quite difficult to work out, but I think it's quite relevant when we talk about gymnasts having to go and isolate for 10 days and then come back into training, that you don't look at what they did last week when they were sitting at home. You actually take an average over the full 4 weeks to get a good idea of where they're at. So the suggestion is stick somewhere in that sweet spot, and risk of injury is less, but it isn't that easy. The other way we can look at it is just looking at what did they do last week, what is a safe increase to do this week. And again, it depends on the sport, but research would suggest, not in gymnastics, that if you increase 10% this week compared to what you did last week, your risk of injury is less than 10%. However, if you increase by 15%, suddenly your risk of injury is over 20%. If you were to do a much bigger increase, say 100%, suddenly your risk of injury goes up to something like 42%. And you might go, well, crikey, we would never make such a big increase in training from one week to the next. But stop and think what happens in school holidays or when you go to a training camp. So in normal school time, the gymnast might train maybe 5 days a week, maybe 3 hours every session. So they're doing 15 hours a week. But school holidays come and you think, brilliant, we can get them in the gym during the day. Think how much we can do. Think what gains we can make. And you're absolutely correct. But if you get those gymnasts in twice a day for 3-hour sessions, by the time you've got to Wednesday lunchtime, day 3, they've already done in 2.5 days what they would normally do in a full week. So if you then carry on and do 2 sessions on Wednesday, 2 sessions on Thursday, 2 sessions on Friday, suddenly they've done double the amount they would do in a normal week. And we definitely see whether they're national squad training camps or whether they're just what you do in the club during the school holidays, we certainly see that the injury rates creep up. But they don't creep up in the first week. It's week 2, week 3, week 4 that we see the gymnasts starting to get injured. So I'm not suggesting that you don't make the most of the time you have in school holidays or at training camps, but really think about what they've done in the build-up and increase gradually. Don't just suddenly go in all guns blazing and double the training load, because you will see that they're more likely to get injured. So general principles then, I don't have any absolute recommendations for you, but certainly try and avoid rapid increases or spikes in training load. We know that weekly increases of around 10% is relatively safe. The problem with that is when they've been off for 4 months because we've been in lockdown or because they've been injured. If you rigidly stick to 10% every week, it will be months and months and months before they get back to anything that is vaguely full training and anything where they can perform at the level they're capable of. So it may well be that you decide to take the risk of we're going to increase by 15 or 20%, and just really closely monitor them. And as soon as they report any symptoms at all, we're going to need to pull back. Plan your training, plan your year, plan your mesocycles, and plan your weekly and daily microcycles. Obviously, you can't always stick to that because things get in the way, but it's really important that you go in with a plan, and particularly that you try and stick to that plan. And then the gymnast tells you, I'm feeling brilliant today, can I do more? You might say yes, but you might also say, no, let's not make the most of you feeling good, because you know that the risk of them getting injured by doing too much is there. You might not tell the gymnast that, but that is part of your decision-making as a coach. Also think about monitoring the response to load, because that gives us some useful information as to how they're coping. To ask them how they're feeling, ask them about their energy levels, how they're sleeping, general stress and mood, how they're feeling. So to summarize then, we're all working in a high-risk sport, high mechanical forces on the body, but to learn the skills that they do, they have to do high repetition to perfect those skills and to prepare for competition. So that in itself is a risk for injury. Think about all the risk factors. If you go back to that graph I showed you earlier, where we spoke about the ones you can modify, the ones that you can't. Do everything you can to control the risk factors that are within your control. Work around the ones that you can't, and just be aware of them. think about their alignment, think about when they are exposed to the highest loads, when they're in contact with the trampoline, the double mini tramp, when they're landing, when they're contacting the tumble track, what position is their body in? Is it optimal? If it's not optimal, is it a technical problem, or is it that they physically aren't well enough prepared to be able to get into the correct position? Think about doing specific physical preparation to protect the most vulnerable parts of the body. And finally, think about their training load, plan it, and then monitor it and monitor how they're feeling. Thank you very much for your attention, and ready to take any questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Lindy. I see in question and answers one question. It's from Peter. I noticed that junior boys are prone to postural misalignment through the hips, twisted pelvis. Do you have any exercises you would recommend to preventing or correcting this?
I think it's a case of trying to work out what the cause is. I'm assuming that you're talking about boys who are going through their growth spurt. Now, sometimes what happens is one leg grows at a different time to the other. So don't assume that growth is symmetrical. So it might be that their right leg has a little bit of a growth spurt for 3 weeks, and then that slows down. And then their left leg has a little bit of a growth spurt for a few weeks. So first of all, think about, is it actually that one leg is longer than the other? Have a look at their flexibility. They may well be tight through the hamstrings or tight through the front of the hips, and work on that if that's the case. Have a look at their squat. Can they do a double leg squat? Go back to doing double leg squats, move on to single leg squats. If they can't do it, try and work out why. Probably also have a look at their hip exercises. So can they do a single leg hip bridge, and can they do it without twisting their pelvis, and work on it, because it's probably partly a strength and partly a control thing. So I don't have a simple answer for you. Just seeing your response, Peter, that you didn't realize that growth spurts could be unilateral. Yes, I think it's a case of, it's quite easy to look at leg length difference. You can just get the gymnast to stand in front of you and put one hand on each hip. And if you realize that the hips are not level, that may be where the problem's coming from. And just reassure the gymnast that it's normal.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Michael. How do you cope with overuse, shine and heel injuries?
I think there are a few things to think about. Obviously, with overuse, think about what their training load is, first of all. Are they doing more than their body is able to cope with? So do you need to reduce what they're doing or move to a different surface, depending on which discipline we're talking about? If we're talking about heel injuries in young gymnasts, I assume we're talking about a growth-related thing, which is very common age, sort of 10 to 12, 10 to 13, and you might just need to reduce the training load. But also look at their ankle flexibility, look at their calf strength, and look at their alignment on jumping. Because if you think about the video that I showed you with the gymnast who turned one foot out and then the whole leg rolled in over the foot, there might well be something in alignment that could be improved that would help to reduce the shin and heel pain. So it's a combination of looking at your physical factors, so your mobility, your strength, and also looking at your training load.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what should be the balance between discipline-specific training versus physics trainings on weekly level?
Again, I think that's a very difficult and a very individual one to answer. It depends on the level of physical preparation that your gymnast has. Certainly with your young gymnasts, you want to be spending quite a lot of time, but be conscious that physical training is also load, and doing too much physical training can also contribute to injury. When you've got senior athletes who have done years and years of physical training, we actually try and keep their physical preparation and strength as short and sweet as we can. We try and do the bare minimum that they need, because we want to focus on them recovering and being fresh when they go and do their technical training. So again, it's plan around your gymnast. I can't give you a specific proportion.
Okay, thank you. Gymnasts that have hyperextension in certain range of motions, can that be a risk of injury while loading?
Yes, is the answer. Now, generally in the disciplines that we work with, we don't see too many hypermobile athletes. Whereas if you look at rhythmic, for example, where they have to have a crazy amount of hyperextension, and that's an advantage, that would be a definite disadvantage in the power disciplines that we're talking about today. I'm not sure what you mean, Colin, by hyperextension. The main one would be in their low back, and if they naturally have hyperextension, we can't take that away from them, but we need to make sure that they are really, really strong around their core muscles so that they don't go into hyperextension when they're loading. So it's about working on the physical side of things to get them strong, and then working on the technical side of things to make sure that they can get the right alignment. But it is certainly an injury risk.
Okay, next one. Do you have any recommendations about how long you can hold the training load of full exercises in training before the competition in tumbling to have some automatization without too much load? I work with a cycle of 4 to 6 weeks maximum. Do you have any recommendation?
Again, I think it's potentially quite individual. Obviously, if the gymnast is training is in a heavy physical block, then that affects what they can do technically. So if they're going into all their technical sessions and they're fatigued, that's going to affect their performance, which is your reason for tapering 4 to 6 weeks out. And I fully agree with that. Just need to think quite carefully about what your taper looks like, though. Because we know particularly in women, females will start to decondition after about 10 days if they're not exposed to their high load. So if you start your taper too far out, they're actually starting to lose some strength and lose some speed strength by the time you get to competition. So what we would typically do would be reduce some of the fatigue and conditioning, still be doing high load strength once or twice a week, but reduce the number of sets until probably 10 days before competition, and then only come off conditioning completely in that last week or 10 days. But we do slightly different things with each individual gymnast.
Okay, thank you. There is a note from Peter to previous discussion. I think our cases are mostly linked to the direction of twist. Maybe it would be fine to say something about the influence of the twisting as well.
Yes, I think that's certainly what we've found when we first started working more closely with trampoline gymnasts. We did find that their mobility in their upper back was definitely much better in their twist direction. So we've worked hard to make sure that they are equal both sides. We've also looked at their trunk strength and endurance to try and make sure that left and right are equal. So we'd aim to, in all their physical work, get them as symmetrical as possible. even though they are dominantly they're twisting in one direction in their somersaults, we can't let that influence their physical abilities. We need to make sure we pick up their weak side. There's plenty of evidence in other sports that suggest that the more asymmetrical you are, the more likely you are to get injured.
Okay, thank you. And the last question we have here, no, not the last. Recommendation for adolescents, correlation of joints and turbulent phase, mainly prevention.
Yes, I think it's the adolescent growth spurt is that very difficult time because you're trying to keep their technical training going, because you know their center of mass is changed, so you can't stop technical training because otherwise you're going to have to go back and relearn all the skills. But certainly spend time on flexibility in particular. And it is mainly around their shoulders, their hips and their hamstrings, but maybe calf as well, and the quads. And then do a lot of patterning work, so just basic body weight squats, body weight lunges, and spend a lot of time on getting all of those perfect alignment. And don't assume because they've done it well this week that they'll still be able to do it well next week. It can change that quickly. So you just have to keep working on lots of control, lots of flexibility, and try and maintain as much strength as you can. But there'll be a good window to pick up strength again after they've gone through their growth spurt.
Okay.
Question.
Teen is coming back to previous discussion again. So you start to build the full routine 6 weeks before competition, and in the next comment, I like to wait as long as possible to start doing full routines.
I think this is coming from a tumbling background mainly, and I'm going to be honest and say the way funding works in Great Britain, that I'm not so involved with tumbling aside from immediately before and at major championships. So I'm not entirely sure what our coaches do regarding full tumbling passes. Certainly for trampoline, we'd be looking at starting earlier than that. We'd want them doing full routines at least 8 weeks out. Some coaches like to be keeping some routines ticking over even before that. But that depends on whether it's a junior athlete trying to put new routines in for a competition, or whether it's a senior athlete that's had the same routine for maybe a year or two and is just really trying to perfect it. I guess if you are building full routines 6 weeks out, that's going to increase your training load. So you may want to pull back on your physical preparation to make sure you don't overload them. Again,
okay. At the moment, I don't see another question. I would like to have one question. You mentioned basically this finishing of the routine on the trampoline with immediately stopping, or one high jump with stopping. Do you have any idea or recommendation what could be the way? Because I already tested with Vladislav Hancharov during the training camp to have 2 jumps. And we found out this is maybe not the way.
Okay, is there no difference in the load? Yeah, I mean, because the rules are what they are, we haven't experimented really with our athletes to see what the difference is in load. Yeah, I'm not sure what the solution is to that, but certainly when you talk to all the gymnasts, they hate stopping because they know how much it hurts their bodies. So all we're trying to do is trying to work on specific physical preparation to get the gymnasts as strong as possible to be able to take those loads. But we don't practice stopping very frequently because we're concerned that if we do too much of it, we're going to cause an injury rather than prevent one.
Okay, thank you. There's one other question. Off topic, are you an employee of British Gymnastics as lead physio?
It's a bit complicated. I'm employed by the English Institute of Sport, but work full-time, sort of contracted full-time to gymnastics within that. It's just a strange way the funding works in Great Britain.
Okay, thank you. Next question, do the landing drills that you showed help build strength or do they only improve technique?
They do help to build strength if the load is high enough. So if you're landing off a high enough box or jumping from the trampoline to landing on a mat next to the trampoline or whatever. At the start of COVID lockdown, if you were to search on Google for, and his name's gone, Alex Natera, Natera. He's got some very good YouTube videos on building strength through doing landings if you're interested in following up on that. The important thing is that what you don't want to do is get the gymnast to jump off a 1.2 meter box and land badly because they're not strong enough to do it well. So whatever height you use, stick to a height that they can do perfectly and then increase the height. You can also add some load, so you can put a rucksack on their back and get them to land with some additional load to help to build their strength, but don't compromise on what their alignment and quality looks like to do it.
Okay, thank you. The next one is in landing. I've seen neutral spine suggested. However, see a lot with anterior tilt and going into a little lumbar extension. Should we aim to limit this and work towards posterior tilt?
Probably the easiest way for me to answer that question is just to find the slide with Zalman, so if you can give me a moment to do that. So if we just have a look at the landing position here, I think we need to just clarify what we mean by neutral spine. If I haven't lost my mouse, that would be helpful. So that is still a neutral spine position, pretty much. So even though he's bending forward at the hips, his upper body is still relatively parallel to his shins. And it's a bit difficult to see in this image, but I would suggest that he is still neutral spine, which is a very slight arch there. If you land in a posterior tilt, which would be tucking under a bit more like that, that would actually put a lot of pressure on the discs. Equally, though, you wouldn't want to see him landing in an arch with his backside sticking out more. You wouldn't want an extension. So I would call that a neutral spine, and that's what we want. We don't want to be too tucked under, and we don't want to be too extended with the buttocks sticking out. So just keeping the back's natural curve, even though the whole trunk is actually at almost a 30 to 45 degree angle to the floor, that is still a neutral spine. I hope that helps.
Okay, I think this is what we have here, and no question more. Okay, at the moment, I would like to switch to this one. Okay. some small introduction of the next webinars. Next webinar is on Saturday, 6th of February 2021. Please remember, it's not in the morning, it's in the evening, 7 p.m. Central European Time, Swiss time, what means, I think, 8 in Great Britain. The expert will be Hardy Fink from Canada, FIG education expert and education committee member. Hardy was the person as FIG director of education and academy program who built all the academy and age group development program for FIG, and this was used at 528 seminars to nearly 9,000 different coaches from 141 countries. That means he has a big experience from all the disciplines, and he will present us the balancing of the learning of difficult skills on one side and the growth of the gymnasts in adolescence with the goal to have a long-term career for the gymnasts after. That means this is the next webinar, and on Saturday 27th of February we have webinar for double minute jump. That means importance of the hurdle jump and tips for learning and improving, what will be provided by Luis Nunez, the TC member and DMT and Trampoline worldwide coaching expert. Anyway, Lindy, once more, thank you very much. And to all of you, thank you for participating, and have a good time. Take care, stay safe and healthy, and I'm looking to see you next time again. Thank you.
Thank you.